Welcome back to another episode. Today, we have an interesting guest on the show. We're also live at Snap Film Studio Shanghai. We're recording this in person. We're going to have an interesting conversation today. Our guest is a professor. She is someone who is a lover of history. She's currently working in that field as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Asla. Come on, give it a clap, y'all. Give it a clap. Yeah. Right.
I'm a university professor and a scholar. I'm a historian of Africa and the African diaspora with a special focus on the slave trade and comparative slavery and also critical race theory. But so my research covers mostly parts of West Africa, Brazil, and the Caribbean as studied comparatively. So it took me a while to figure out what exactly I was going to do, but the broad contours of what I do were already in place pretty early on. My entire middle school and high school education was in French. And around the time I was 15, I discovered that French was not only a European language. And I felt very cheated on. And from there on, I developed a big interest in learning about the Francophone world. That was my main point of entry. So, and that was one reason why I decided not to go to university in France, because I knew that the education I'd be receiving would be quite traditional and I wouldn't have enough space to explore, and probably that the narrative I would be fed about the African continent and the African diaspora would also be a pretty traditional one. So I went to college in the US and started exploring. My main point of entry was literature because that's what, I had been familiar with and experienced in before. But then I majored in critical social thought, where I designed my own major in colonialism and post-colonialism in West Africa and the Caribbean. Double majored in Spanish language and literature, and did a certificate in African studies. So during that time, I studied abroad in Senegal. That was the first time I set foot on the African continent, and it changed my life. And after I graduated, I took a year off to work as an editor and a translator at a publishing house. Then I went and got a master's in history because actually during my undergraduate years, I realized that what I enjoyed the most among, all the different subjects I explored was history, and I actually wrote an honors thesis at that time on post-independence life in Senegal, and especially the processes of transitioning from colony to independent state and the kinds of challenges that posed. And at that time, so I'm originally from Turkey, everybody was telling me that I don't know anything about my part of the world. And I was like, oh, you know what? Fine, I'll go and learn about it. And so I did my master's at Central European University in Budapest, and actually worked on nationalist Turkish historiography. I think nationalism is a huge disease. And, I really wanted to explore that from the perspective of my own history. But when that was done, I decided that I really wanted to go back to what I've always wanted to do. And so I went to Tulane University in New Orleans, where I did a PhD in Latin American history for 9 years. Wrote a 600-page dissertation on...
600?
Yeah. On basically the testaments left behind by freed Africans in 19th century Salvador da Bahia. So I see myself basically as part of the scholarly effort that has been very prevalent in African diaspora history over the last 30 years, which seeks to access the voices and life histories of enslaved and freed people themselves in the diaspora. And the way in which I try to do that is by privileging the Africa within the narrative as much as the diaspora, because often for African diaspora historians, Africa tends to become this gray, blurry hole, which, where everyone puts everything kind of under the same umbrella without paying attention to the nuances and differences that are at stake.
Okay.
For example, African studies, became a field in, Western universities from the 60s onwards. And the way it happened with, a lot of young idealist people who, went from the US or the UK to Africa, and they wanted to be part of the labor movements and the independence processes. And they were not really expecting to find as much history and culture. And when they did, they felt like they needed to bring it back and make it part of the mainstream, the scholarly mainstream. So, and then in the process, they also became extremely protective of it. So there, a certain narrative of African exceptionalism, and especially the exceptionalism of the different areas that they study, accompany that effort. The other hand, you have the development narrative, right, which basically still posits Africa as outside of the course that is supposed to be required. And, it sets a norm that is set by the West, and then Africa needs to follow it. That's a completely different narrative. Then there is the Wallersteinian, world systems narrative, where Africa fits in a certain way, but only really through its connections to other places. And it's always about those other places and not about Africa. And then we have the diaspora narrative, right, which is a very complicated one because it's laden with emotion. So that is the narrative of the descendants of enslaved people who are looking for their roots and their origins. And there have been important conflicts in the sense between Africanist scholars and African diaspora scholars. Because Africanist scholars, like I said, they posit a certain exceptionalism, but they also, really fight to have the African continent be valued. But at the same time, they do not pay enough attention to the kind of urges, needs, and, the emotional place from which African diaspora scholars speak. Right. And so one thing that a lot of people in my field have been saying for like the last decade is that we need to communicate and collaborate and, add the diaspora to the study of the history of Africa. And on the other hand, add the continent to the study of the diaspora, but not simply also in terms of methodology and impulse and approach and starting point. Of course, from the point of view of, regular people, a lot of their actual experiences are not being taken into account and included within these, right? And we don't make the necessary comparisons, we don't make the necessary connections. When we make them in completely erroneous ways. Like one thing I constantly tell my students is that you can't compare a continent and a country, right? Or you can't compare, you can't compare China and Africa, right? You need to, one might be a lot bigger in size, but you still need to compare China and Nigeria or China and Cameroon. And the African continent is an extremely diverse place. It has extremely diverse histories, languages, cultures, ethnic makeup, and it's often all of those gets grouped under like one umbrella. And we keep saying that Africa is a continent, right, not a country, but like we say that for a reason, because it literally gets treated as such all the time.
One thing that I hear you mentioning is the need to include academics from the diaspora as well into the research that's being done on African history. And so when you say academics from the diaspora, like what does that mean? Is it African Americans or African academics? Like, is there a difference between that?
So, I do want to refer in that sense to the descendants of enslaved people in the diaspora primarily.
Okay.
But then again, if you migrate today from Africa to elsewhere, so the next generation is going to be a diaspora generation as well. Yeah. And in that same way, they're going to have multitudes, they're going to come from a multitude of perspectives and experiences. A lot of the, the best writers today in the diaspora, like, for example, have you read anything by Aminata Forna before?
No.
So she's basically a Sierra Leonean who grew up in the UK. And she has a very strong grounding in her original culture, but at the same time, a very different kind of command over the English language that even Chimamanda Adichie doesn't have, right? So we always need multitudes of perspectives, in everything. And I'm by no means I'm trying to say that also we only need academic perspectives. That's what I can speak for because I'm an academic, right? But at the same time, I see it as a completely joint collaborative effort. So, the cultural part, the artistic part is maybe more important even than the academic part.
Yeah.
But I've never been artistically inclined. This is what I know, and this is what I can speak for. So.
Right. Great insights. I strongly agree with a lot of what you've said. In a lot of the materials that people find, or that I personally have come across, in terms of the concept of whether it's African culture, African history, slave trade, and everything. There is not a lot of representation on the part of whether it be African Americans or someone who's moved to the diaspora or even just Africans themselves. So I hope that that change really comes into the academia space. But let's talk about academia. Like I'm also trying to get a PhD, but in today's world, and I know that we've sort of had this conversation before, what is the value of being like very academically inclined in today's world?
Is there a value? I don't know. Let me backtrack though, because when you say including African Americans, so a lot of our diaspora narrative ends up being U.S. focused, and and that's very interesting because actually, when you think in terms of numbers, as a main region that received the the greatest number of enslaved people, we have the Caribbean. The only like one, entity, first imperial, then, national, that received the greatest number is Brazil. Then comes Spanish America, and only then comes North America. And actually, it is very much a minority in terms of numbers. So this is a very big question. Like, why does the African American experience dominate our understanding? And, a lot of the reasons for that are to be found in the way in which slavery became an institution in the antebellum South, that defined social relations in all spheres of society and among different groups, right? There's a reason the U.S. literally went to war over slavery, right? Nowhere else in the world did.
Right.
And at the same time, that this understanding of what we call the one drop rule, right? That you're only white or black, right? We don't have elsewhere. So it basically enforces this polarized understanding of race relations, and simplifies also a lot of the narrative for us. But you can't do that when you're dealing with Spanish America. You can't do that in the Caribbean. You can't do that in Brazil.
Right.
And so we also, when we think about the African diaspora, we need to move beyond the African American experience within it, because the diaspora is so much bigger.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
As for the whatever value in academic contributions, this is something I ask myself a lot. I mean, I often wish I were one of those more diverse people who had a multitude of talents. I used to be a good creative writer when I was younger, and then over time, I completely sacrificed that to dry American-style academic writing, which, that was basically forced upon me, over my years of education. I do think academics can make a contribution. I don't know if theirs is the main contribution, but I see this as a joint effort. And when I refer to it as an effort, nobody studies slavery and the slave trade without caring about their manifestations in the modern world, right? So for me as well, the main reason why I studied it was because I decided very early on that race was the biggest problem in the world today, and that it needs to be tackled, right? So, different people can contribute to this in different ways. So political activists can do their part. The community is huge, is the most important element in this discussion, right? They can do their part. Again, creative, artistically inclined people can do their part. But there is also the kind of knowledge that only academics can contribute to this conversation, because race relations are experienced in different ways in different parts of the world because of the histories of the slave trade and slavery that preceded them. And these are things which, these are historical events with huge consequences that affect our lives to a great extent today. That's the only incentive also for studying history, right? If you don't care about what's really happening at the current moment, then I guess you can be the perfect ivory tower historian who, doesn't give, let me control my language, a damn about, any contemporary issue or, anything related to our daily lives. But that's never the kind of historian I wanted to be.
Okay. Interesting. So the concept of race, I like that you actually you touched on that. Is there, because I would say that for a number of people who have never left the shores of their countries, whether it's more predominantly Africans, um, the understanding of race is different for them. So in this world of TikTok and Gen Z kids, where they have the attention span of what? Of a mosquito or whatever. How do we explain race to them? And I mean, the bigger is race really that big of a deal? Is it?
I think it's a huge deal.
Okay.
Often these questions become much more poignant when you have to move beyond your reality, right? I mean, on the African continent, historically, people have defined themselves in a huge number of ways. Often there are identifications at the village level. It can be at the level of the ethno-linguistic group. It can be at the level of the region. It can be later on at the level of the nation. And but nobody becomes Black until they encounter a white person, right? In the same
Right.
way. So it's always through othering, it's always through encounter. And that's how the majority of our narratives of power and domination have been shaped. We still perpetuate the encounter narrative for when Columbus came to the Americas. Today, we complicate it. We say that there were many midpoints, that, the Spaniards first went to the Canaries, that they had already experiences with people who looked different from them during the Reconquista, during the time that Spain was under Muslim domination, or that they had other experiences in the sugar islands of the Atlantic, with which they took with them to the encounter, and the encounter happened in the way it did exactly because of that. Right? So, but basically, when you are happily living within your family, the place where you are especially a majority, and you don't necessarily think about these things. You start thinking about when you have to move beyond that, and then you need to bring your own identity into question, and you need to do that in conjunction to the identities of others. So, for example, when I first moved to Senegal when I was 20, was the first time in my life where I truly understood what it means to be a minority. Right? Like everybody around me was African, and I wasn't.
You were not. Okay.
But until you experience it yourself, and in some ways very starkly so, it may not necessarily come into question directly in your life. But we lead global existences. And there is something called global historical responsibility.
Well, what is that? Just for people who do not know, what does that mean?
Yeah, this is something that I've really struggled to try to explain to my students, in China especially, on many occasions. Because there is this understanding that, okay, since, race relations didn't exist like this in China, or we didn't have the same kind of colonial history, they don't apply here.
Oh.
That's not true.
Yeah.
First, because actually there are a lot of similarities. I mean, you can find slavery in the Tang Dynasty, and also over time we end up sharing and internalizing the same racist narratives in a lot of ways. So, you might have grown up in a Chinese village. You might not have encountered Black people in your daily life.
Yeah.
But you have read about them, you have heard about them, you've seen stereotypical depictions of them, and So you have already, as a young person, shaped a narrative that is in many ways going to be biased, right? So I don't get angry at the reaction of children. And when I first moved to Senegal, so many kids would cry at seeing me in villages because they had never seen someone like me. Right? So natural reaction by someone who has never encountered someone who looks like you is something that one can understand, hoping that it will be corrected over time. But it stops very early on because also, like you said, like Gen Z and TikTok and like people get, children get fed information from extremely early on as well. So it needs to be countered pretty early on.
Okay, let me put it this way. Like, I've never felt strongly about race until I came to China.
Exactly. You have to be out of your... I mean, when you're the majority where you come from, you need to get out of it. Then there are the people in the diaspora who have needed to face that basically from the moments they were born. Right?
Yeah.
Because even in their own countries, they were not perceived as the norm. So, and that's a very difficult existence to lead. I can understand it intellectually, but not at a visceral personal level. It's never been my experience. It's never going to be. And that's what I mean also, that when I said that we need to take these emotional impulses that come from the diaspora and which often result in excellent scholarship, right? You don't want emotional impulses that result in crappy scholarship. But as long as they like actually lead to good, strong, solid scholarship, you can come from different experiences and different incentives. Right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Let me take you back to your time in Nigeria. That would lead me into the conversation that I want to have the most. Tell me about your time in Nigeria, because she actually did part of her university, right? Or was it a...
It was actually when I was in grad school when I started going to Nigeria.
Okay.
So I hadn't traveled to Nigeria until my PhD.
Oh, okay.
And I had traveled to many other parts of West Africa, but not to Nigeria. And then, so I really wanted to study the diaspora, and I wanted to study the diaspora with a very strong element of Africa. And in Brazil, as in Cuba, as in many other places, especially in the 19th century, as a consequence of the oil wars, a huge number of enslaved Africans were of Yoruba origin. And I was very lucky that at Tulane at the time, we had this amazing linguistic anthropologist who became an aunt to me and who we lost 2 years ago, unfortunately. And I started learning Yoruba with her. And I also started traveling with her and conducting research with her. And over time, she trusted me so much that she actually had me teach colonial Yoruba.
Oh, wow.
Which is basically, so I was teaching about the forms of Yoruba currently spoken in Cuba, Brazil, and Trinidad, primarily in ritual settings. And and in that way, I also ended up having access to places and people in Nigeria that otherwise I would not have had.
Wow.
So I was very, very lucky in that regard. And I really miss her.
See, guys, come to Nigeria. But
Nigeria is amazing. I mean, Lagos is an incredible city. Like, it's so lively, so beautiful, so chaotic, so creative, so much fun.
Yeah.
And And just like also just gorgeous, right? Like there are. I mean, you might not think the crowds are always that gorgeous, but they also
Yeah.
are in their own
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Yeah. They are. One interesting thing I wanted to discuss with you as well was, so I've taken some time to sort of dig further into the Yoruba as a people, as a civilization. I like to call it that. Um, and I found similarities in several. I mean, I'm nowhere as traveled as you are, and I'd like you to see if you found that. But for example, here in China, Guizhou, I've been to Guizhou, and I've seen elements of their culture that if I didn't go there myself, I would have said this is from Yoruba people. And also in parts of Cuba, also in Brazil, where they even have this, I believe it's one of the deities, but it's, in my opinion, I think it's just a replica of Shango. So I don't know how true that is, but they're strikingly similar. So in your experience as well, have you seen, knowing how much you know about the Yoruba culture, have you seen that similarities in different parts of the world as well?
So I can't speak for Guido. I mean, a
Okay.
lot of cultures end up having similarities because also humankind is not limitless in what it creates, right? So
Right.
you will often see similarities even in places where you don't expect,
Expected.
but that sometimes easily becomes a pretext for engaging in a developmentalist narrative.
Mm,
And, in China, for example, how minorities are approached, I would be very careful if I were you saying something like that, because that can very easily give way to a developmentalist narrative of like, oh
mm,
yeah, they're, all tribes, or they're all, traditional. Traditional is such like a meaningless term in the way it gets applied
right.
and to different places to mean completely different things. But so maybe not Guido.
Okay.
But so with regards to Cuba and Brazil, so basically it depends on where you are in Brazil. But in Salvador de Bahia, where I conduct my research, and also in Cuba, the 19th century was a Yoruba century. So until then, for example, you had a lot of Bakongo people from West Central Africa, different groups being lumped together. There are processes of ethnic and cultural clustering in the diaspora, which changes identities to a certain extent. But the 19th century is a Yoruba predominant century, and to a lesser extent, you have representation from other ports of what we call the Slave Coast, which somewhat corresponds to the Bight of Benin.
Okay.
So also among the Yoruba that arrived in the 19th century, a lot of people belonged to the priestly class,
Mm,
which meant that they could bring a lot of religious knowledge with them. So we have very clear residues, continuations, but also reinventions and reformulations of Orisha worship
okay.
in these two places, and to a minor extent in Trinidad that I just mentioned.
Mm,
So, but there are a lot of adaptations and transformations. So in Ilefe, in Nigeria today, there is only one day of the year that doesn't have an Orisha, right? There are 364
right.
Orishas. A lot of these Orishas, first of all, enslaved people could not worship all of them. They didn't have the resources nor the freedom. So they had to pick and choose.
Mm,
And so some disappeared and others were readapted. So, for example, Shango, which is much more a deity of war in Nigeria, became much more a deity of justice in the diaspora, because that's what you
oh,
need within slavery,
right.
right? Or, Yamonja, is still very motherly in the diaspora, but these are places right next to the sea, so she becomes the protector of fishermen, right? And gets the representations, the physical representations change, so on and so forth. And there are differences between Brazil and Cuba. So, for example, in Shango can be transculturated, and I'll get back to this with Santa Barbara in Cuba, right, with a woman, for example. So how does this work? So the term transculturation was coined by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz in 1947, and it basically...
I'm going to pretend that I know who that is.
basically means two different belief systems or cultures coming together to form a new whole. So don't think about it in terms of syncretism. It's not two parallel systems. We liken it, and it's a good way to explain to students, to an onion. That you peel it, you get one layer, another layer, but it's the same whole. So Africans in the diaspora were obviously not free to observe their own rituals and follow their own deities. So what did they do? They took a Yoruba Orisha and transculturated it with a Catholic saint. So Catholic saints are very similar to Orishas in a certain way because they were human, right? And they became close to God, but they have, you know, certain characteristics in the way, like physical characteristics, but also personality traits and certain things that they are supposed to be good for. So, right, so certain saints should be prayed upon for a certain disease or a certain kind of problem. So it was very easy. And also, think about like Iberian folk Catholicism. So most people can't read, right? A lot of them just know certain things, and often they focus on the physical characteristics of things. So often the hagiographies or the life histories of the saints, but also how they're depicted in imagery, statues or other representations in churches. So it's very easy to take the Virgin Mary and liken her to Yemanja, right? Both are motherly, both intervene on the behalf of people between an inaccessible God and the people, both protect people. Both are depicted wearing white or light blue and long robes. And so they basically made it one entity. And it's a bit difficult to understand for people who study this from the outside, because you're like, okay, of course they knew they weren't. But no, they became the same entity, right? So there is a Brazilian novel, for example, Pagador de Promessas, that speaks about this. It's about, I don't exactly remember anymore, but like the person makes a promise to the Orisha, right? But then goes to pay the promise at the church. And, you know, the representatives of the religion have a really tough time with it. But for him, it's one and the same. And so this kind of transculturation happens in different ways between different Orishas and different Catholic saints. And in the process, a lot that are really not applicable in the diaspora disappear. Because, for example, if you're an enslaved person working on a plantation, you don't necessarily want to pray for a good harvest. Right? So, like, for example, the orishas of, like, agriculture and bountiful harvest and, like, a lot of things become irrelevant. And in Cuba and Brazil, we have different numbers. But so 20-something in one, 30-something in the other, right? That's the number of orishas that are worshipped. There are some differences in how they are depicted, and also racially, which is very interesting, right? Sometimes like Yemanja can be like Oshun can be black or a mulatta, or it really like depends. And they will also be transculturated sometimes with different Catholic saints.
Okay.
And but it's a really fascinating phenomenon. And there is this understanding that Yoruba religion was open enough that rather than disappearing, it was able to bend and adapt and therefore survive in the diaspora.
Okay.
And this did not happen to the same extent with others. And again, you have to go back to the dynamics of the religion itself, but also to, it's always a two-way process. It's what's imposed on you and it's what you choose yourself, right? And they're very, very evident here.
Right.
So this is, for me, what's most fascinating about the African diaspora, because in places where you would think, that places that you would imagine would be dominated by suffering, you have incredible resistance, resilience, but also creativity. Right. And that is the marking characteristic of the African diaspora today as well, right? Yeah. And including the African continent in the diaspora.
Yeah. Interesting. So for a lot of people that do not know about the Yoruba culture, I believe this was the first conversation we ever had, which is when you asked me, oh, what part of Nigeria are you from? And I said, I'm from the Yoruba tribe. And you said, no, they're not a tribe. And I was like, thank God, finally. How do we have this conversation? Because I strongly believe that the Yorubas were a civilization. And I mean, I might be crazy here, but I would even liken it to the Roman civilization. And
tiny bit off there. Yeah.
But yeah, how do we have that conversation with what is a tribe and what isn't?
So in this context, then tell me why you called it a tribe. Is it because...
I think at the time, because it was just easier that people would comprehend that. And the reason I said is because, for example, like the guy from Zimbabwe that I was talking to, when we had this conversation, he's like, oh, I'm from the Shona tribe, or I believe, I can't remember exactly where. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm from the Yoruba civilization, the Yoruba people. And he's like, what is that? I'm like, well, it's not a tribe, it's a civilization. And he's like, yeah, but it's inside of a country that's... So it's having, the dynamics of having to explain that every single time is why I just, okay, yeah, in that regard. So, but, I do want to keep having that conversations to make people understand more that there is a difference between a tribal definition, which also, if we're really thinking about, has more, derogatory connotations, as opposed to a people, a civilization, and things like that.
So the term we use in African studies is ethno-linguistic group, right? Sharing an ethnic identity and sharing a linguistic identity. I think also calling, referring to the Yoruba people is a good idea. Civilization might not hold because you might again be positing a dominant position with regards to others, right? The UNESCO has a few very good introductory documents about why tribes should not be used. And often I start an African history class with having students read that. And there are some very important problems with this. And first of all, it becomes this umbrella term that is supposed to apply to, the Tiv, who are a few hundred people, to the same extent to millions of Yoruba, or certain tribes in different places which really can, like really do embody certain characteristics that we associate with tribe in an anthropological sense, but also with some of the most advanced civilizations in the world in a certain way. So the moment you use just like tradition, right, a term to like apply to anything and everything, it loses all meaning.
Yeah.
Second, and perhaps most importantly, it very much corresponds to this developmentalist narrative, which seeks to posit the path of primarily Europe and then other Western places that have followed it as the norm, and then all the other places in the world as lagging behind because maybe they're not doing it at the same pace or in different ways. And so it really becomes a nonsensical word. And when you are within such a developmentalist narrative, actually, Africa is not going to let you, right? So, like, I mean, you basically have, let's look at, I mean, the Igbo, for example. You have agricultural civilization without the plow.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
That is not going to work in any Eurocentric narrative.
Yeah.
You have complex market economies without all the Marxian elements that we state need to be a part of them, and so on and so forth. So it's important to be able to study and describe what is in front of you. So the country that is Nigeria today is home to a number of centralized and decentralized states, right? So the Efik and the Igbo are extremely decentralized. That is evident in the manner in which they conduct their slave trade. That is evident in the number of suicides within the Atlantic slave trade, because these are people who are not used to respecting authority, right? A central authority.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have the Yoruba, which are a very huge centralized state. And then, you know, that makes certain things easier, but that's also why the oil wars have such devastating consequences when the central authority falls. And that's why so many Yoruba end up being transported across the Atlantic in the 19th century. So, but we need to be very careful about the differences, the distinct histories, the distinct societies, polities. Polity is also a word I will refer to African polities.
Okay.
Right? Because nation comes with, you know, the nation state, Berlin Conference, which is, you know, and those implications. But when you refer to African polities, it can be any form of polity at any moment in time.
Okay.
But this is a big, big discussion. But the Yoruba are certainly not a tribe. There are also like ways in which, you know, especially the British approached South Africa, and in which they really wanted to create this tribal discourse. So I think when we were speaking about this last time, that is something you referred to, and I really do think that the South African experience in many ways becomes this determining experience for a lot of the countries around South Africa. And Zimbabwe is definitely among those. And, you know, so is Namibia and Malawi. And, you know, even though you do have like German influences and like, you know, Dutch influences in the region. So, but Zimbabwe, you know, even as your like last name, you have several choices as what to use. And one is your tribal name. So that is a discourse that, you know, people are familiar with from the moment that they're born, that they constantly hear, their ethno-linguistic identity be referred to as a tribal identity. So unless they have a chance to study something different and, question it, that is just going to be something they're going to take for granted.
Okay.
And
wow. Interesting. The concept of identity, I guess, is the main thing at the core of this. Is like you've said before, you need. Well, I don't know if I could say you need, but your identification is a function of the time and place that you're in. Like I told you before, I primarily do not identify as Black because I don't see any part of that word that truly represents who I am or where I'm from. But I also understand that I do not exist as an island, and my interactions with people, it's a back and forth. So I guess it's just truly hoping that people learn, first of all, their own identity, and be grounded in that and see how they can juxtapose that with, their interactions with other people. Because to be fair, are we ever going to get to a point where you 100% describe yourself to people and they accept that, okay, I say he said he's this, that's who he is? The chances of that happening is just really, really low.
Our identities are always contingent, right? So they're always relational. So I used to know one Turkish person in the city who left, and I don't know anyone else, but I never try to, because that's not, the way that's not something that has ever mattered to me. And I lived in so many places and had so many diverse experiences that probably I would describe myself in 50 other ways until I'm like, oh yeah, I'm also Turkish, right? So it wouldn't even occur to me. And also when I'm back home, people speak to me sometimes in English in the street, and they, I don't think I'm stupid enough to make major cultural mistakes, but probably the way I walk or talk or express myself is already so different that people can pick up on these subtle clues. But also I am Turkish, right? I do speak that language. My parents are there, and if I get to go there this summer, there's a whole bunch of food I want to eat. So, but also, the way I'm speaking to you now is completely different from how I spoke to you at the wine tasting, or how I spoke to you when we were having beers and dinner the other day. And it's also different from how I speak in a classroom. And we have a lot of different identities in ourselves, and we pick and choose according to different moments. We operationalize different parts of ourselves, right? So I may not identify as Turkish at all, but you say something, I don't know, stereotypical and discriminatory about them, then I will react.
You go off.
The same way that, if somebody comes and acts really racist towards you because you're Black, then you will internalize and assume that part of your identity under those circumstances, right? But all of these things are parts of ourselves, and they come to the forefront according to different needs under different circumstances.
Right. Interesting. I definitely agree with that. And I don't want to keep you for too long because, wow, we're running out of time. But there's this quote that has always stayed with me, and it's about history. It's from a movie, actually. Shout out to to Pasha, is my movie line nerd. So it's where this guy in the film said, so this guy went on about history and we need to keep the sanctity of history and this and everything. And this villain comes in the story and he says this, and I will never forget because after he said it, I was like, oh wow, that is true. He said history he's written in the language of the oppressor, or maybe oppressor is not the word, but basically from the person who has the upper hand at that time. As someone who's studied history and who's still studying history, do you agree with that? And the second question to that is then, how do we really verify what is true and what is not?
There is no truth with a capital T in anything but religion. There is always a multitude of truths,
right.
a multitude of perspectives. And, when I write, I offer one perspective. When I'm writing, I try to take as many perspectives as I can into account. But there will be many different perspectives about the same event, phenomenon, era, constantly. And all we can do is to approach complexity as closely as we can. We're not there to provide answers. We are there to try to approximate an understanding as much as we can of lives that we have not led. And it's very true that traditionally history has pretty much always been written from the perspective of power. Over the last 50 years, in many different areas of history, people have constantly been trying to change that. One way I try to do that is by trying to discern the narratives of enslaved and freed people themselves. But then again, even I can try as hard as I can to come as close. Somebody will have a completely different interpretation of the same document, of the same story, of the same narrative. Okay. And that's not a limitation. That's the beauty of history, right? As long as you don't accept that there is such a thing as historical truth, which is something that I try to break in my students all the time, because what is historical truth today will not be historical truth tomorrow. It won't be the day after, and it wasn't the same one yesterday. We just try to make sense of the past in order to make sense of the present. Okay. And so there is a quote, since you started with a quote, there's a quote that I love by Maya Angelou, which I might not be able to replicate exactly. But it basically says that there is nothing we can do about changing the past. So history, as hurtful as it may be, if we manage to face it courageously, we can do something about the present. And I also think we can do something about the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is a bomb. We can do something about the present and the future. Do you guys have any historical questions that you want to?
No, we're basically just fascinated by the information we obviously did not know.
It's not really a historical question, but I have one for you. Because you start from phrase, it was a phrase that nationalism is a disease or something like this, yeah? And after Tayo asked you about the culture, you said that it's really important. And you talk a lot about this, and I was going with a question like, how come? Because basically one, for me, like in some way, like it goes to another. It's just one is like normal way, and another is like like horrible way of the same part. But after, in the end, I realized that you feel yourself just as a cosmopolite. You're not Turkish. You're.
Yeah, but I am also Turkish, of course. And there's no, to deny that would be really stupid.
Yeah.
But national identity is an important thing. It's one of our many identities. So, the moment you turn it into any kind of ism, right? When it becomes an ideology, that you can fight for and discriminate others against, and you know,
kill
that you
people
kill
for.
people for, go to war for, then it's a big problem. And I think some of the biggest crimes in the world have been committed in the name of nationalism, right?
True.
Nationalism is also a new phenomenon, right? The concept of nation as we understand it today doesn't exist until the 19th century. People see themselves as part of empires. People, you know, see themselves as part of more complex states, and so on and so forth.
Don't you think so?
I think there are a lot of differences, but there is a core within it that you can refer to as a national core. But the ways in which those sensibilities get operationalized in the course of history is a much more recent phenomenon. And I mean, I am, you know, Turkish of Greek origin primarily. So, like, you know, my family's partially from, like, Crete and Thessaloniki and Macedonia, and, you know, and you see people who are, so there is a theorist of nationalism, Tom Nairn, and one thing he says is that the closer you are, the more acute nationalism you're going to have, because you can't necessarily differentiate yourself naturally, so you're going to try to do it through domination and power and war. So, you know, when you look at a lot of the cultures that were part of the Ottoman Empire, and especially for someone like me who doesn't identify as Muslim in any way, I look the same as, you know, my relatives in Greece. Like, I speak the language, we eat the same food, and then you can kill in the name of what nation you belong to, right? That's the point where it can take you. But you can argue this for any ideology taken to the extreme, right? But, I mean, I think it's a huge problem, right? And I think it becomes much more acute and poignant when identities are close to one another, because basically the only way you can differentiate them is really by force, right? So I also think of it in these terms. I don't love anyone in this life unconditionally, not even my parents, right? I love them, but I still criticize them. I still get angry at them. There are things that I don't approve. There are things that I don't appreciate. And I will voice these things and try to do something about them, actually, because I love them. If I didn't care about them, I wouldn't do anything. So this idea of, you know, loving a person or loving a country in a blind manner, I find very senseless and stupid, right? If you love your country, you should be willing to criticize, right? You should be willing to try to change it, to make it better. Right?
Just as if you love your child and he does something.
Exactly, right? Like, I mean, if you're just defending it blindly and acting as if it's perfect because it's a sacrilege to say something against it, I mean, that's a very foreign notion of love to me.
I think it also feeds, I definitely hear you. I think it also feeds into perhaps the conversation we're having before about the other guy where, and this is like super hypothetical. Is it possible that someone does that from not a position of power, but from a position of trying to defend themselves? Like, I can totally imagine someone maybe saying something bad, for example, about like, or like shitting, totally like crapping on Nigeria and everything. And that response is more hostile than how I would usually respond. Like,
yeah, but you've been attacked in the first place.
Okay.
So you are responding.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
I mean, obviously, like, when I say you don't necessarily need to blindly love your country, that doesn't mean you need to let it be, you know.
Big crap. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, obviously, and like, but you also need to do it in a way where you take into account what's wrong with it and what's great about it. And no place in this world is perfect.
Right.
Right. So, and but I have come to a stage that certain discussions I'm like literally refusing to have. Like when I see that somebody comes to me with a completely, preconceived notion of something that they're not going to be willing to change.
Yeah.
I don't have the patience anymore to
have that
actually try. Like, so I'll
conversation.
just be like, I'm not even gonna talk about this. And I used to be more patient before. And but over time also you realize that if somebody through the ways people are expressing themselves, like some things are just not gonna lead anywhere.
Right.
And I mean, I don't know, you wouldn't necessarily discuss racism with a white supremacist from the US South the same way, you wouldn't,
Right.
Here you wouldn't, if nobody wants to be critical of the state, you wouldn't have certain discussions about China with people. Like, I just don't have the patience and energy for it anymore.
Right. I definitely agree with that. One thing a lot of people have been talking about is how people are moving towards radical positions in terms of their political disposition now, where, like you say, some people are just not ready to have these conversations.
I'm sure there have been people, who were very stuck up in their ways throughout history. Perhaps something that is happening today is how, through this two-way process, people are being made more and more defensive, right? But for example, if you think about global Islam today, right, the way it has become this extremely radicalized but really aggressive thing is also because people were not given a voice and a place for a very long time. So you can say that what's happening in Turkish politics today is because of that. Right, that for a very long time the people who were in power in the country were people like me and the Muslim majority and who wasn't necessarily educated and whatever, didn't have a voice. So they people do react to things. And you can argue the same about US-China politics today in multiple ways, right? But I'm pretty sure that during the last days of the Weimar Republic before World War II, people in Germany felt similarly as well. Like there is a certain sense to history repeating itself. And it's always an action and a reaction, right? People are always responding. I do agree. I think the world is in an especially crappy state right now in a lot of ways.
We all need a hug. There should be a national World Hug Day where people just go and just like, don't worry, because it's that way. Oh well, that gave me a good idea now. Speaking of masculinity,
gender pride.
So I had an interesting conversation with another lady who she's very pro women, but she says that she's not a feminist. So would you describe yourself as a feminist?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Okay.
But luckily for me, it has been something I never necessarily had to fight for. Like I was, my mom was actually, one of the leaders of the feminist movement in Turkey. So I was lucky enough to be raised without any burden of tradition and treated always that way in my own setting. So it's something that for me is just a given. Like it's never been something that I feel the need to necessarily shout about or problematize. I'm much more intrigued by alternative feminisms around the world, for example, African feminisms, right? Okay. Because, a lot of what I saw in Africa at a very young age already were things that, Western feminists would not perceive of as feminism. But again, what you perceive of as women's power and everything, this changes very much from context to context.
Okay.
And I find it very funny for a woman to say I'm pro-women but not a feminist, because that's the only thing literally that feminism means. The way we try to imbibe it with like an extra ideological meaning, and to say that, it's literally just that. And it's literally like, if you actually read about feminism, it's only about that. And then there are a multitude of discourses and approaches within it. So, for example, I don't know, I was just rereading Patricia Hill Collins's Black Feminist Thought lately, and I was struck by, on the one hand, when I had first read it, I hadn't noticed, but it's also extremely Western-centric. And so, I mean, there are different approaches and there are different understandings, but the moment you are an independent, strong woman trying to make your own way in the world in one way or another, and you can choose to do this within very traditional structures as well, you are a feminist. There's...
Okay. Yeah.
You know what? I think, like, from my perspective, I can understand that woman. I think she's saying that because for me personally, what is going on in United States, for example, what they're calling feminism, it has nothing to do with feminism. It's something disgusting, horrible. No. Like, I can say, like, I'm married, and for some period of life, we were living just because of my wife. She was supporting me financially, like, and all other ways. So, like, especially in China, I truly believe that women are much stronger than men, and they need to get more opportunities because this country is super men.
No, I understand absolutely what you mean, but that is based on an unfounded understanding of feminism. So to say that the way feminism is used and applied in a certain place is wrong doesn't take anything from the concept and its value itself.
Yeah.
I mean,
definitely, but I think, like,
yeah, I mean, I get it. Yeah.
Like, if someone calling himself, I don't know, well, American, and he does horrible things, any other American, he doesn't want to say that he's American anymore.
I think, like, though, like a more articulate way of, communicating that would be that, yes, I'm a feminist because I believe in women's empowerment, but I do not agree with the way feminism is being deployed and experienced in the U.S. today, right? Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah. I don't either.
No? Okay. So let me drop a bomb on you.
Ouch. What
It's
time
coming.
is it? What, how much bomb are you?
3:16. Are you a coffee drinker?
No.
Thank God. That's the bomb.
Why?
Because I don't drink coffee as well.
Really?
Yeah. So I was going to ask you that if you drink coffee in all your travels, what place has had the best coffee that you've had? But since you don't drink...
I am horrible. So I need caffeine in the morning, and my years in the US have shaped me to such an extent that I drink Coke Zero the moment I wake up. And it's pretty sad.
Is it really Coke Zero though?
God knows what it is. It has caffeine and it has fake sugar, and it wakes me up. That's all I'm interested in.
Have you tried green tea? Green tea contains a lot of coffee.
Yeah.
The thing is, you need to wake up enough to make tea. The same way you need to be... I'm always like confused as to how people who need to have coffee first thing in the morning can be awake enough to, like, boil the water, put the coffee, like...
And do all of that.
With you about that, when you drink tea, yes, it has a lot of caffeine, but it wakes you up slowly.
Yeah.
Coffee instead wakes you up immediately.
And when you grab a Coke from your fridge, it's like literally getting it into your veins right away. Like it's
So you've had Coke Zero now for how long? Just if you put a number to it, 10?
no more. Like since
Oh, wow.
like more than 20 years.
You're a stakeholder in that company now. Yeah, you should have shares.
I know.
So is it like you don't drink coffee at all? Because for me, it's...
I don't like the taste of coffee. I mean,
so it's the taste.
yeah, it's a pretty weird coming from a Turkish person, but it's just
Is
not at
coffee
all.
a
I don't
Turkish thing?
even like the smell of it.
Oh, okay.
So like people will be like, "Oh, it smells so nice," you know, and be like,
Same for me.
or like I
Really?
won't eat coffee flavored dessert or ice cream or yeah.
I do like the smell. I just don't like how it makes me feel.
How does it make
I
you feel?
drink coffee and I feel like a rabid dog. Like I get super hyper and my brain is like on steroids, which is not necessarily a good thing because then when it wears off,
You have a crush.
I
yeah.
just like, oh my God. So that's what I don't like it. I've tried decaf coffee. It still gets me high. I've tried all kinds of I'm just like, okay, this is not
So maybe
working
it's
for me.
something else in the coffee, not just the caffeine that gets you.
What else is in the coffee?
Oh.
Guarana, or it's an energy drink.
And
Sorry, I'm usually not coffee drinker.
I think actually I have a question for you because I really loved your speech about nationalism, and if I would say hundreds or thousands of years ago, we're talking about like I come from that village or from that city, and that was part of me, and I would say like I'm kind of in a national way. That's where I come from, and like person from another city, it's already something opposite to me. Nowadays, we're talking about countries, I would say, and what I like about nowadays, it's kind of growing. Maybe at some point in the future, we will get to the point that we will identify ourselves, not like a person from one country or city, but from the whole planet. What I see right now, for example, if you come from European Union, you would probably say, yeah, I'm from European Union, so something bigger than a country.
Yeah. And also our countries, you know, I mean, I love immigration. I love the fact that our countries are becoming more diverse and more multicultural, right? I mean, that's how you get creativity. You get, you know, actual cultural, artistic like production by putting different influences
And especially
in
for
conversation with
experts,
one another.
because,
Yeah.
I also like when you said, like, I can't identify myself already as a Turkish people. It's same for me. Like, when somebody asks me, like, where are you from? I'm from Belarus, but I already spent so many years and I've lived in so many countries, so I can't really identify myself as part of one country. But I would love to talk about myself as part of the whole world.
Yeah.
That explains why I thought he was German when I first met him.
Yeah, so when you spend so many years in different cities, countries, talking to so many people, you already pick so many things from different cultures,
Right.
nations.
And the best part is you can pick and choose. You can pick your favorite parts from different places and identify with those, include those, right?
Yeah. So I think that's the whole thing, that we have an opportunity to travel
To do
and
that.
to learn
Mm-hmm.
and to grow in these terms.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love traveling so much. That's one thing that, like, if I were born male in, like, the time of, like, the conquest or whatever, I would be one of those people who I criticize all the time. Because that's how people traveled then, right? So that's how you got to go to different places
By
and
joining
see
a
them
conquest.
and, like, yeah.
Ah.
And, you know, or through colonization, like that's how people went. And that's how, you know, any European would have ended up in Africa, right? So it's pretty lucky that we live, you know, at a time where we can like see the world freely and be enriched by it.
And do that. Great. So one last question before we wrap this up.
Because I killed the coffee one.
So you also travel a lot. What are your top 3 things that you must have with you outside of your passport on every trip. I got
Ouch.
her. I
Yeah,
got her.
you did.
That's hard.
A can of Coke Zero.
Well, luckily that you know, imperialism has worked in such a way that you can find Coke wherever you go.
You are
Maybe not zero, but
still Coke.
there is like in every village anywhere in the world you're bound to find Coke. And now more and more Coke Zero. So you might not find a fridge to have it cold, or you might not, but
that
you
is
will
true, though.
find
Like,
it. Yeah.
anywhere you do find Coke.
And sometimes it'll be cheaper than water. Like it's like
Oh wow, okay.
yeah. No, that's like capitalism at its best for you.
In Nepal, country next to China, it's really hard to find Coke. It's easy to find Mountain Dew,
But not Coke.
is something like
If you can't find Coke, you can find Pepsi. Like one of the like
Okay.
you can
The
find
two devils.
Yeah. I honestly don't know the answer to this question. Like I don't know like what are some I mean it would very much depend on like traveling to this place I need to have these.
Okay.
But not necessarily things that I feel I used to joke that as long as the place asked for a yellow fever vaccine and a malaria medicine, I was at home. But I've also traveled to many places that
That didn't
don't.
require
But
that.
some of my favorite parts of the world do.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I would say my camera.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah, I guess now my phone. Now that we're
Right.
so yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. So, have you ever recorded a video, like made a video, any kind of video?
No. I mean, yeah, and when I travel somewhere on my phone, I'll record a few minutes. but-
Okay. So, do you use social media that often?
Less and less in China.
Okay.
I mean, the last 3 years, I don't connect to a VPN very regularly. But, I mean, I still use it.
Okay.
And, I mean, I have, I traveled to more than 100 countries. So I know people across the world. And social media makes it easy to at least, like, know what they're doing. Because you're never going to have the time to email
check
them
up
or,
on
like, and...
100 countries, you say? How many countries are in the world?
About 170 something. Yeah.
So, you're almost there.
Yeah, but COVID set me back, but hopefully I can. I always kind of wanted to be a travel writer, but then like I never I
Got to that.
yeah.
Academia takes you.
It
takes
takes
your time.
everything from you.
Takes your time.
Not just your time, your life.
It takes everything. Well, thank you very, very much. Time is already gone. I hope you enjoy this because we really
Very
did.
much so.
I really did.
Yeah, it was a great conversation.
Yeah, and thanks to Snap Film Studios. See these guys, they're amazing.
I know.
They're amazing. So if people want to follow your work, because I know that some people might want to ask you questions, they might want to read. Where can people get in contact with you? Where can they find your work?
My work is only on academia.edu. A few
Okay.
things are.
Okay.
If people wanna, hopefully, I'm kind of interesting at least beyond my work. So if they want to talk to me, otherwise,
Of course.
on like Instagram, Facebook, yeah.
For someone who's traveled to 100 countries, you are way more interesting than us.
It's
Okay.
just one way of being interesting, but yeah.
So, what is your Instagram handle?
Actually, both of them I can be very easily found by my name.
Okay.
It's my first name and last name.
Okay. All right. So we'll put that in the links for people who want to find her. If you'd like to connect with her, we'll also put everything there. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
It's our pleasure. And that's going to be all for today. Thank you, guys. Thank you to Nick. Thank you to Pasha. Thank you to Tony. Thank you to Alex. And yeah, this is going to be an interesting one. We'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.